Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here, today with a sewing tutorial for Greenstyle's A Cute Triangle Bikini Bottoms. These bikini bottoms certainly live up to their name with side ties, 3 options for coverage, as well as an option to color block the front. Here are the pieces you'll need to cut to make the color block version. All 3 of the optional color block front pieces. Starting with piece P4 here, make sure to mark the notch labeled letter A on this piece. Piece P5 has a notch labeled B, so make sure to mark that on your fabric as well. And then finally, piece P6 in the center has 2 notches labeled A and B. Make sure to mark those notches so that you put these pieces together in the correct order. Additionally, choose between the cheeky, mid, or fuller cut line and make sure that your cut is consistent across all pieces. And that also goes for piece P2, the optional back main piece. Cut 1 of each tie piece, C1 the front bikini tie and C2 the back bikini tie. Make sure to mark the notches on both of the pieces, and those notches correspond with the coverage option that you chose. Cut 1 of piece L1, the front back liner. To color block the front pieces, lay them all on the table with right sides facing up. Match up the notches labeled A first, and lay them with right sides facing. Pin together and stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch or serger. If you stitch with a sewing machine, press the seam open, and if you stitch with a serger like I did, press it to one side. Then find the notches labeled B and match those up with right sides facing. Pin together and once again stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, press your seam to the side or open and then bring over your back color block piece. Pin the 2 pieces together at the crotch seam, stitch together again with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. For all options, place the liner and the front together with right sides touching and pin along the long curved edges. Notice that the liner is slightly more narrow than the main pieces, and that is intentional so that the liner gets pulled toward the inside of the suit as you wear it. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you'd like to add elastic, stitch it into the seam allowance at this point. I'm using cotton swimwear elastic and stitching the elastic on at a 1:1 ratio, meaning I'm not stretching the elastic at all. Make sure that the elastic is only in the seam allowance and doesn't wander over into the main body of the suit. It's also a good idea to stitch it to the main fabric side of the seam allowance just to ensure that it doesn't push the lining outward. Take your tie piece and fold it with right sides together. Pin in place if you'd like to help you. Stitch beginning at the folded edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Come to the corner and then continue stitching down the length using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You can use a serger for this step, but I much prefer my sewing machine because I can maneuver much more easily. I'll start the stitch with a straight stitch so that I can reverse stitch to lock my stitches. Using a straight stitch along this straight edge at the very top is perfectly fine. Once you get to the corner, with your needle down, rotate the fabric and switch to a stretch stitch. Stitch continuing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way to your markings. Once you arrive at the notches that you marked on your fabric, mine are marked with 2 straight pins, lock and end your stitches. Leave the center section of the tie between the markings unstitched and stitch the other end of your tie. I've drawn my stitches with some white chalk so you can actually see what I'm doing here, but we're going to begin by clipping the corners, and this is going to remove bulk from inside the point of your tie. That way when you turn it right side out, you'll get a nice little point at the end of your tie. Just be careful to not snip any of your stitches. You also want to clip into the fabric right at the markings where you ended your seam. Now turn the ties right side out. I use a combination of my fingers to pull the fabric right side out, and I'll also use a knitting needle with a blunt end to help poke out the end of that tie. When doing this, be really gentle and make sure you don't poke a hole through the end of your tie. But I'd love to hear any tips or techniques that you use to turn out ties like this. Once you've turned the ties right side out, press the open space in the center outward and it'll stick out just like this. If you're using a slippery swim fabric like I am, you may find it helpful to baste those raw edges together to keep them in place. Now place the tie onto that front back piece, lining up the raw edges and with right sides together. Pin or clip into place. I'll be basting all along these raw edges here, but you could also baste just about an inch in from the edge, which is shown in the tutorial. For me, it's just easier to continue the basting stitch all the way across. This basting stitch is particularly helpful to make sure that the tie and the main body fabric stay lined up at that squared corner. Now use your stretch stitch or serger in a 3/8 inch seam allowance to stitch into place. Now flip the tie up and push the seam allowance down. You can top stitch and catch the thread tail in your top stitching, or you can use a large-eyed needle to run it through that seam. And after that, you are done. Congratulations on completing your very own A Cute Triangle Bikini Bottoms. We can't wait to see what you've sewn. Be sure to share your makes across social media using hashtag GSTriangleBikini. Until then, happy sewing from all of us at Greenstyle.